Good morning and welcome to WSDOT's first all-staff Teams Live meeting. My name's Chris Rietman-Aberdon and I'll be your facilitator today. After Secretary Millar and Dr. Mosseth speak, we'll have time to answer your questions. To ask questions, click on the icon with the quote box and question mark. It is located in the banner at the top of the screen, just to the right of the leave box. Once the Q&A feature is open, you'll see a box at the bottom labeled Ask a Question where you can type in your text. As a reminder, we have a lot of staff with us today. Please keep your questions on topic and brief so that we have time for as many as possible. Now let's get started with a few words from Secretary Millar.
Good morning, everyone, from sunny Olympia. But as you can see from my nifty new Teams background, winter is coming. We've all been hard at work navigating the pandemic, adjusting to changes and facing challenges in our personal and professional lives. This is a lot to endure, and we're still very much in it. It's good to see so many of you join us today for this important topic. This virtual all-staff meeting is a first for WSDOT. It's an opportunity for us all to learn together about what we can expect in the next few months and what we can do to cope better with what's happening in the world around us. I know that many were not able to make today's all-staff live, so we are recording this so that it can be shared with all of our colleagues for their benefit. I've shared this in a couple of staff meetings, but while I have you all here, I just want to make clear that you, the people of the Washington State DOT, are the greatest asset this agency has. It's not trucks, it's not equipment, it's not bridges and roads and boats, it's people. And my goal since the start has been to keep you safe. If you're at home, that means keeping you home. If you're at work on the road, on a ferry, or in a terminal, that means keeping staff that can do their jobs remotely there so that we have the PPE we need to keep you safe. None of this is perfect. None of us are perfect. I don't know about you, but this has been hard on all of us, but we are getting through this together. We know that there's a powerful connection between the body and the mind. Our mental health affects our physical well-being. Some might find this a difficult discussion. We're a can-do organization, and it hurts sometimes to say, no, I can't. I know this isn't okay. We're in a time when we actually need to think about our self-care as a matter of safety, which is one of our agency's core values. So today's presentation will tell us more about what to expect in the days and weeks ahead and where we are on a larger scale with how we are each responding to this pandemic emotionally and physically. We'll learn about some of the tools we need to get ourselves, our families, our families, and our WSDOT family through the next fall and winter months in a healthy way. So our role at WSDOT is to keep our state moving. We can't do it properly without a healthy, resilient workforce. We can't do it without you. It's important we remain vigilant with both our physical and mental health and safety, which is why we're having this first ever all-staff meeting. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kira Mouseth. Dr. Mouseth is a practicing clinical psychologist who splits her professional time between seeing patients at Snohomish Psychology Associates, teaching at Seattle University, and serving as a co-lead for the behavioral health strike team for the State Department of Health. The doctor's work and research interests focus on resilience and recovery from trauma, as well as disaster behavioral health. She's worked extensively abroad with earthquake survivors, refugees, and relief workers, and throughout the Puget Sound with first responders, like many of us, and healthcare workers. So we're going to hear from her for the next 40 minutes or so, and then take questions from all of you via the chat box. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to our virtual stage, Dr. Mouseth.
Thank you, Secretary. I appreciate the introduction. Happy Monday, everybody, such that it is, and good morning. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate the emphasis on, oh, I don't know if this is, can you hear me? I'm sorry. It says that I'm muted on Teams. Am I muted?
Nope, I can hear you and see you, Dr. Mosseth, and if you could share your screen, I can queue up your PowerPoint.
Great. Thank you for having me, and we will just jump right in. Is that working?
Yep, we see
Great.
you and your PowerPoint.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us here today as we talk about what's coming and then also what we can do about it. I really like to focus from a behavioral health perspective on action items and sort of efficacy around what individuals can do to support themselves and support their family and friends and community when we have the energy and whatnot to do that. So I will just go ahead and jump in. I'm going to talk about some key definitions and give you just some baseline information so that we're kind of on the same page with what I'm talking about when I'm referring to certain concepts. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the forecasting work that we're doing on the state level across behavioral health impacts and looking at trends and how people respond to disasters and what that means for Washington specifically. And then I'm going to talk about what is being manifested in the workplace right now, what many of us are dealing with on a regular basis, the kinds of symptoms and the kinds of issues that are really, really commonly experienced right now, and then what we can do about it by focusing on the ingredients for the development of resilience. So I'd like you to consider burnout as being an imbalance of what's going out, the outflow versus the inflow. And what's going out are the mental and physical and emotional resources that you put into your job every day. What's coming in are the positive things, the congratulations, the kudos, the good feelings. Sometimes we refer to it as compassion rewards that come from doing our work. What's going on in the context of a disaster is that burnout increases because our brains actually lose the capacity somewhat to process that positive stuff. And I'll talk more about that in a second, but burnout is pretty common right now. And it's when there's this imbalance of outflow versus inflow, at least in terms of perception. Compassion fatigue is a term that's most frequently used with healthcare providers, but it certainly applies to all people who have a public-facing job or interact with the public on a regular basis, which certainly applies. And then resilience and resilience factors are the two things that we're going for here. So the kinds of core values that were mentioned and the kinds of things that we can prioritize and sort of motivate us to get us through, you know, these fall months and the winter and what's coming. Okay, so this chart is a reflection of a bunch of data that has been collected over a variety of disasters for many, many years. And we've looked at things like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, floods, critical incidents, like school shootings, tornadoes, all kinds of disasters internationally and in the United States. And we know enough about how human brains and bodies respond to disasters to have a sense of a pattern that people go through after they experience something like that. So in Washington State, if you overlay this disaster sort of response pattern for behavioral health on top of COVID, the impact phase for Washington was approximately mid-March of 2020. Then we progressed up into the heroic and honeymoon phases, which was about late April, early May, maybe kind of rounding that peak in the honeymoon phase towards the end of May. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but then after the end of May, we headed down into this, down the hill, into what's called the disillusionment phase. And the disillusionment phase typically occurs between about 6 to 9 months post-impact from any disaster. It's usually the hardest time for people on a behavioral health level. And the reason for that is that there's a couple reasons, but number one is that we're exhausted. We've been in a disaster response for 7 months now. Our brains are full of cortisol, which is our stress hormone. We're tired of navigating all of these changes. And humans don't like change by and large. We're really uncomfortable with the unknown. Sort of as a species, we struggle with adapting to things. And that 6 to 9 month window is really when it starts hitting us about the reality and the grief and loss associated with what life might not get back to, the kinds of things that are likely to not change back to the way that they were, and how we're going to have to adapt moving into the future. It doesn't have to be a negative thing at all. And certainly there is lots of room for hope and opportunity here. But the reason why the disillusionment phase is so hard is because it's about that acceptance piece, about what 2019 had, what January and February had, and what the disaster has sort of changed in our lives. And it's difficult for folks. Unfortunately, also, what's layering with that for Washington State specifically are the other ingredients that come at this time of year naturally. So with the change in weather, we have daylight savings time, more darkness. When it starts raining and getting cold, people stay inside a little bit more. And there is an uptick in what we call seasonal affective disorder, which is sort of the natural depression that comes with fall and winter months at higher latitudes because of the darkness. So we've got that. We've also got the election coming up, and regardless of the political like sort of perspective that you have, the election experience is pretty stressful for a lot of people right now. Again, in November, right? That's layering on top of the seasonal conditions and what would be already be happening anyway, which is that disillusionment phase. You take that into consideration, and then you look at what's happening with the numbers, with the infection rate specifically for Washington, and it's a little bit, it's back to that unknown. It's a little unsettling because we aren't sure how this is all going to play out. If there is another big second wave for Washington in the fall months, that is going to be a challenge for people because we don't know what the subsequent economic and social impacts of that wave will be. And again, because we don't like the unknown, that's a challenging thing for us. So it manifests itself in a whole bunch of different ways for people, and there's a lot of individual differences. But this phase that we're in right now is amongst the most difficult of the disaster response and recovery cycle. The only other thing on this chart that I will point out that I think it's really important to keep an eye on is that we get back to normal. We get back to our baseline level of behavioral health functioning within about 12 to 18 months post-impact. Almost everybody does. It doesn't mean it's not rough in the middle and there's all kinds of ups and downs, but by and large, the outcome that the vast majority of people experience is this return to baseline level of functioning, even when things are significantly different. So please do keep that in mind. Now, these are two potential scenarios for what could happen with the COVID infection rate. The blue waves represent the numbers of infections. Please note that there are no numbers on the y-axis there that represent, a specific number of cases or anything like that. So we don't know exactly. And then the orange, yellow color waves are the corresponding behavioral health symptoms. So depending on the size of the wave that's going to happen, that we're kind of heading into now, it's likely that people's experience of behavioral health problems is going to get high and stay high for a while. We still will recover to baseline. It just might take a little bit longer than that previous chart was showing. We don't know. And that depends a lot about how the next 6 to 8 weeks sort of unfolds. Okay, key things to know from our forecasting work. We're looking at about 3 million people in our state who are very likely to experience clinically significant behavioral health symptoms in the rest of 2020 and then early into 2021. What I mean by that is typically anxiety and depression, like significant depression symptoms. And when it's clinically significant, that means it interferes with people's ability to function in some way, right? Either to work or to enjoy their life at home, all kinds of different ways. That's that's around 40% of our population. And so those numbers are a lot higher than numbers that we've seen in the past from many other circumstances. And that's going to be something that collectively, if we're aware of, we can sort of get out in front of. It's the idea of flattening the behavioral health curve a little bit and building resilience now to help this support as many people, including all of ourselves, as possible, because no one is immune to this, right? No one is immune to these behavioral health effects of being in a disaster for 7 months. PTSD is not going to be the common response for COVID. That depends on your personal experience with it, how close you are to someone who has had it, if you have had it, all of those kinds of things. So there are exceptions, but by and large, across the population, depression is going to be the thing that we're most concerned about. There were lots of ups and downs, and I'll show you a chart in just a second that indicates that. The summer was really an interesting one in terms of people getting out, maybe visiting family or traveling or just getting outside in ways that they hadn't before, and that helped a lot with depression and anxiety. So we want to advocate that when it is safe to do so in terms of conditions, that people continue to spend time outside, even if it's raining, get bundled up and get out there, because that's really good for folks. We know also a known thing with disaster response is that substance use increases across the board. We know that that's the case. That has certainly happened in Washington State for both cannabis and alcohol sales, based on tax revenue data that we've been able to look at. So a lot of people, when they are experiencing significant emotional distress, they'll use substances as a coping mechanism. That's not uncommon at all. I guess one of the other takeaways here is that it's usually more likely to be an underlying existing problem that gets worse rather than someone who uses substances for the first time in sort of a new way. The exceptions to that are some younger folks between 15 and 21. And then also we have concerns about what's going on with substance misuse with people over 60, particularly when it comes to medication mismanagement, whether that's intentional or not. We've had some interesting data this concerning from the Poison Control Center about medication errors where people are doubling up on their medications. And in great part because they're not following up as usual with their primary care physicians about things because they don't want to risk getting an infection. So that's an important sort of another piece of this puzzle as we move into the next few months. Okay, so like I mentioned, the disillusionment phase is uncomfortable and challenging. As we're seeing in the news, there are limitations to disaster support. So there's times when money runs out and assistance, the limits of the assistance become clear. And we're in that right now. We're seeing that. And that is consistent with the 6 to 9 month sort of window when disillusionment typically occurs. This is very, sort of an expected thing to happen. And then there's a gap between what you expect and what you want to have happen, like the return to normal, and what we're actually kind of struggling with living in right now, which is some of the online school, some of the balancing of the home and work environment, which is so difficult and so challenging for many of us. Burnout is likely to be the biggest, one of the biggest issues for many people during this time, and it's really, really a challenge. And it's definitely increased, and it is different depending on resource availability and economic pressures that people are experiencing, for sure. Okay, this is one of the charts that I was just mentioning. The gap in the middle represents when we weren't able to collect the data, but this is from a nationwide, what's called a household pulse survey. And in July and August, and even into September, early September, anxiety and depression were sort of all over the map and going up and down. You'll notice that the trend lines for both, the anxiety is the purple-blue line, and the depression is the green line. That the trend continues upward, and the most recent data that I've seen goes just past this on where the chart ends, and it is continuing in that direction. But the summer months really indicated that people had some positive experiences with getting outside and with enjoying nature and sort of reconnecting in that way, which was great. Okay, so one of the things that we need to sort of brace ourselves for or prepare for the likelihood of is if we get hit with a second big wave in the fall months, that may trigger something that's called a disaster cascade. And that's when there are multiple impacts within the same 12-month window. We know that this happens. It's happened historically all over the place. And keep in mind, please, that the baseline response, the recovery response, the baseline level of sort of normal is to get back to that place in about 12 to 18 months post-impact. When you have a disaster cascade, that still occurs. It just takes longer to get there. It also means that people's experiences of symptoms are likely to be a little bit more significant, a little bit stronger. So we don't know the extent to which this is going to happen. I will say that for those families in Washington State who have been displaced by wildfire or who have lost their homes as a result of the fires, they have already and are currently experiencing this. So it's just even more difficult for those groups of folks, which is helpful to keep in mind. Okay. As I mentioned, most people will return to their baseline. 14 to 18 months is what we're looking at for COVID, because we think that slope is going to be a little bit more shallow than it is for other types of disasters. A new normal will begin to establish itself, and then or a disaster cascade for the fall, which we don't know. Okay, good news. We're going to turn the page and focus on how these things are manifesting and how normal it is, and then what we can do about sort of bolstering our resilience moving into the next 6 month sort of window. So the long-term response is resilience, and it is something that can be taught. You can develop resilience. You can teach others how to do it. People have sort of an innate level of resilience, and that's great. But once you learn what those ingredients are, you can go about developing them and intentionally working on making them stronger within you, across the board throughout the community. So the ingredients of resilience, and I'll come back to this again, are connection, purpose, flexibility and adaptability, and hope. Those are the 4 things that we're going for in the resilience pie. I like food. Use some food metaphors. So the way that this is manifesting itself and the way that our resilience is really being sort of challenged right now is because these 2 pieces of our brain, the prefrontal cortex up here and the limbic system, which are the big sections that are highlighted, are really being challenged. This is a normal, straight up biological response to 7 months into a disaster cycle. What ends up happening is that our brains are being flooded with cortisol, and they've been in a stress or a fight or flight mode for an extended period of time at this point. And that's not normal. Our brains are built to withstand bursts of stress, bursts of adrenaline, bursts of cortisol to help us get through a difficult situation, not a 7 month ongoing difficult situation. So we struggle a little bit neurologically with how to respond. And what ends up happening is that the limbic system, which is where the emotional processing of our brains takes place, the limbic system becomes more influential because it is constantly scanning for threats. It's checking out, like, where's the next hit going to come from in 2020? There's plenty of memes that joke about, what's the next thing, right? What do you have on the bingo card for November for 2020? But the idea is that your limbic system is cued in. It's just focused on where all the threats might be coming from. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for all that higher level thinking, organization, planning, all the executive functioning, detail tracking, focus, that part isn't as engaged because it's not as essential for survival. So that part doesn't, it's still there, but it disconnects a little bit and it doesn't communicate as effectively with the rest of our brain. So that can be problematic at work, right? It can be problematic at home. If our limbic system is more influential, it means that we are all responding to each other in a potentially more emotional way or a more impulsive way than we might otherwise. And there are consequences for that, right? People are a little bit more snappy, a little bit more short or quick to anger. And that's a straight up neurological function of where we are right now. But once you learn that information, you can be empowered to sort of work on that. So this is, excuse me, this is one of the checklists that I joke about experiencing on a regular basis, on a daily or weekly basis, just being distracted, not remembering things. It is so common right now to forget what day of the week it is. There's so many reasons for that. One of the biggest ones is that the part of our brain that tracks memory uses physical markers in space to process time, our experience of time. And when we don't leave our house, for those of you who are working at home at all, it messes up that piece of our brain in terms of its ability to track time and process time. So if you lose track of what day of the week it is, please recognize how normal that is right now. Oh, the kiddos in the background. Also, being quick to anger or easily frustrated, having frequent headaches or stomach aches, that is your body's somatic manifestation of cortisol. Headache, stomach ache, headache, stomach ache. It's just, there's too much and it's making us feel really uncomfortable. We also, many people are reporting that they're having trouble falling or staying asleep. Usually that's looking like lying in bed, not able to turn your brain off, let it shut down, just like, and not necessarily that you're anxious about something, but you just can't shut it off. The other thing that I'm hearing is that people have no trouble falling asleep because they're exhausted, but they wake up at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, like wide awake, what is going on? The other thing that's really common is carbohydrate craving. I joke about getting a tan from the light in your refrigerator, very common right now. The other one that I heard last week, which is great, which is that I've been snacking so much that the buttons on my shirt are starting to social distance from each other. The carbohydrate craving is so real, and normally it increases in the fall and winter months anyway, but we've been doing it all year, and here's why. If you eat carbohydrates, they create a chemical precursor in our brain to a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter that makes us feel all sort of warm and comfortable and fuzzy. So carbohydrate craving really feeds that a little bit, and it makes us feel good, which is why we do it. And then feeling disconnected, feeling cut off from people because we're missing out on that water cooler chat, that water cooler discussion that we used to have, just kind of seeing people and chit-chatting about stuff. So it's a challenging thing. It's a challenging kind of combination of ingredients that we're dealing with right now. And it looks like anger, frustration, fear, and then less capacity to just process things on that higher level, which certainly has implications for our work, right? Okay. So keep in mind, please, nobody is immune to this, right? And the reason why that second sentence there is bolded and italicized is because even if you were coming into this disaster with great coping skills in place, continuing to do that and continuing to focus on resilience is necessary for everyone. So keep going, keep at it, don't give up on this, and continue to develop these skills. And I'll give you some specific ideas about how to do that. Okay, other workforce factors that contribute to burnout. So what else is going on with our brains right now is that when our prefrontal cortex is disengaged a little bit, and we're focused on threat scanning, right? Our limbic system is looking for threats. One of the other sort of consequences for that is that we lose our ability to perceive, to attend and perceive and process positive rewards and positive feedback, kudos and congratulations. That's not important because it's not in the threat category. So our brains actually don't notice it as much. And then we don't, it's kind of like water off a duck's back. We hear something nice, or we get a thank you maybe from someone in the public or a community member, and we're like, yeah. And we kind of shrug it off and then we focus right back onto the next potential threat that's going to come. So it's really, really challenging, and it is in part what increases burnout, because we're not equally balancing our attention to the positive that's coming in, as well as the negative and the potential threatening. Okay, so what can we do to reduce burnout generally? Purpose, connection, flexibility, adaptability, and hope. And I will speak much more about all of those in just a second. Remind yourself about things that motivate you in order to increase your sense of purpose. Redefine that. What's getting you out of bed? What are you contributing to? What do you need for yourself and for your family? Whatever you have the bandwidth to do is sort of what really matters here. And then maintaining boundaries. That is key for all of us with our work. Knowing your limits, saying no to things. I appreciate the secretary mentioning that that's a really big challenge for people, and you know, we can do culture, and that's the case for a lot of folks. And it doesn't mean saying no across the board. It means recognizing when you've reached a personal limit and you need to take a break from something. It also means not working when it's not your time to work, right? Having a really clear delineation between on duty and off duty hours, you're on or off, and having limits around that we can all support. And then connecting with people. That's a super big challenge right now. Continuing to maintain social connections within work, right? As part of meetings as well as outside. Okay, so what to do now? We're gonna transition to this next phase about how to operationalize this. What's done is what matters. So modeling from the top down, which is why I appreciate really the opportunity to have this presentation for you all today, is because we can all influence ourselves, not only ourselves, but everybody that we sort of work with, by modeling the importance of prioritizing resilience and self-care. Once that becomes sort of embedded in the culture and we all do it, it's good, it's taken care of. And so it's about really modeling for other people, showing people what's done is what matters and not what people are told to do. And that's at any leadership level, right? Being honest and open. When you don't know, say you don't know, and that's okay. It's better to say that you don't know. This is out of data from China and Italy with COVID specifically, because there are so many unknowns about this virus. To tell your team you don't know for sure, and that we're working on it and we're figuring it out, but we don't have all of that information yet. And then active listening. That active listening is a fairly simple, not necessarily super easy to do, but fairly simple intervention that is one of the most effective strategies you can use in helping people recover from being in a disaster. And that is listening to other people with the intention of understanding and caring what they're saying rather than to problem solve. That does not come naturally to most of us. We are a problem solving culture. It's like, what's the issue? Let's figure out a solution for it. And that's usually great to operate that way. In this case, in a pandemic, in a disaster, when the problems are so nuanced and so big, active listening is a better option, because you can't actually problem solve a lot of the things that people are struggling with right now. So listening to people and facilitating just that communication in a different way, those are really helpful in terms of people's resilience and mental health. This is the way to do it. So you ask open-ended questions, you reflect back what you think you heard, and then you listen with the intention to express care and understanding. That's what empathy is. It's not feeling sorry for somebody, like the pat on the head, like sympathy. It's feeling it with them, standing in it with them. And even if you don't know what to say, right, you can say that. I don't know what to say, but I'm really glad you're sharing it with me. And that is a very empathetic kind of a comment to make to someone. But you have to mean it too, right? So open-ended questions, summarizing, not parroting back, but sort of, so you're saying that this is happening. Do I have that right? So that they can correct you if you don't have it right. And then trying to understand fully and care. Again, simple, not necessarily easy. Okay, we develop resilience. These are the two like sort of buckets, internal strengths and external resources. I really encourage everybody to make a list. You're 7 months into this, you've survived it so far, right? What has worked well for you and why? Why did it work? And then what resources are still needed? And then the internal strengths, cooperation, problem solving, self-awareness. The one that I like as a clinician is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our belief in our ability to achieve a goal. And most of us have our self-efficacy has taken a hit in the last few months because we haven't been able to reach our goals that we've set for us because of the circumstances. So we need to adjust our set of goals. We need to change the scope of our expectations of performance for ourselves and for our family members, for our kids right now, because we need to continue to practice success, and we cannot hold ourselves to the same kinds of patterns that we were living in 2019 when those things don't apply in a disaster recovery context. So adjusting our scope and our scale of our goals in order to continue with self-efficacy. Okay, here are the ingredients. So what motivates you? What's connecting you to others? And then how can you be adaptive and flexible? With purpose. Don't think too long-term or too big picture. Identify what do you need to accomplish in the rest of October? Keep it small scale. Don't be too big in terms of the scope. That's the adjustment that's really necessary. And then connection can be anything. It can be to a higher power. It can be to a service group or an organization. It can be to a family member or a child or a friend. It can be to a pet. Connections can be anything that keeps us from isolation. Human beings are not meant to be in isolation. And then adaptive and creative. So how can you be creative with physical distancing, but still being socially connected? Lots of interesting ways to do that. The internet is full of ideas, some of them better than others, right? But keeping it adaptive and flexible with your workspace, with your home environment to the extent that you can. And I recognize that there are real life limits for all of us that apply here. And a lot of luxuries associated with having space. And if you don't have the luxury of physical workspace that's separate, then try to do it in terms of time. So if you're working at your dining room table, for example, right, chunk out the time so that this is a work table for these hours or this hour, and then it's a family table for this hour. To the extent that you can create new boundaries around your flexible schedule is a better thing. Okay, the REST model is an acronym that I developed to help people remember how to help avoid burnout and compassion fatigue. So 4 small things you can do. Reward yourself for a job well done. Remember that our brains have trouble processing positive rewards right now, so we need to build that into our cycle. Try to keep it minimal in terms of the reward being a carbohydrate kind of a reward or a substance reward, like a glass of wine versus half a bottle. It needs to stay in the healthy zone. So the rewards need to stay healthy, right? Establish boundaries. Boundaries are good. They're good for you. They're good for other people. Emotional, physical, and mental boundaries. You do you, and they do them. And keep that separate, right? Keep that time. Your time off needs to be separate from work entirely. And then sharing your experiences. If you have an encounter with a member of the public, if you have an encounter that's really difficult with a colleague, try not to internalize that and keep that to yourself. Try to share that with somebody to the extent that you can. Participate in things. If you notice yourself voluntarily withdrawing and isolating from stuff that you normally wouldn't, that's an opportunity to re-engage. Just pay attention and continue to connect. And then trust your network. If you need to say no, as hard as that is for many of us, as a team, right, we can be there to pick up the slack for each other. So it's around recognizing today I just can't do this thing. I need help, and trusting that it will get done somehow, and that you can do the same thing for others when they need to say no and pass something along. So we all kind of can take turns with that. That's about trusting your network to be there for you. And then the last bit before I talk about resources is just recognizing that taking care of yourself now will really help with this, this disillusionment phase, getting out in front of that behavioral health curve, staying outside, continuing to just even walk to the mailbox every day. As much as you can, there's a real indicator for positive mental health effects. Taking off time that's entirely not work related, and then getting processes in place in every team to model those boundaries, that self-care and this resilience development, like get embedded in the culture with that. And then we'll do better. Like we will collectively do better as a result of that. These 2 last slides are pages of resources. Chris, I think will be happy to share them out with you. I'm happy to give you whatever information that we can. All of these things are available on our website, which is on the next slide. The 2 that I would recommend strongly is this guidance for building resilience in the workplace. That's the bottom link there, as well as the toolbox for families. We wrote a multi-page document about how to help support kids from preschool age all the way through high school, early college age, what they might be going through in some ways that people and caregivers can help support them. So those are some really, I think, good resources. Everything can be found right here on this page. And then there's some more general coronavirus resources from the state on that second website. We would also recommend that you follow up with the Washington Listens line. If you need to talk to somebody, they are a professionally staffed support line who can refer you to various services and sort of figure out what might be needed in terms of external resources that you might be interested in. So check out that Washington Listens line. Okay. I think, let's see, I will stop sharing for the time being and turn it back over. See if there are some questions.
All right, Dr. Massa, thank you very much for this. We did receive a lot of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can.
Sure.
I'll start with some signs of and tips, signs of depression. One question came in is how do we recognize signs of depression, anxiety, and acute stress in ourselves and members of our team? You kind of touched on this in the presentation a little bit. Can you go into a little bit more detail, please?
Of course. The biggest thing is that those individual differences are strong. So the biggest indicator of any of those issues, anxiety, stress, depression, is a serious change in baseline for that person, right? So normal behavior is normal. Normal is different for everybody. So what you want to be looking for is a serious change or a departure in what that person or what you used to do, right? So if you used to do X, Y, and Z all the time, and now maybe you can't because of COVID, but even if you have the opportunity to do so, you're not doing it when you normally would have. Those are the red flags. So significant departures or changes in behavior that are abnormal for that person or for you. And then keep in mind too, people tend to either act out or act in. That's normal with disaster recovery. And what I mean is acting out looks like substance use, maybe swearing, fighting, aggression, maybe illegal behavior, acting out, right, with the expression of stress. And the other side is acting in, and that's pulling back. That's hopelessness and sadness and withdrawal and isolation. And both of those things can manifest outside the home as well as within the home. So you want to look for those behaviors as well as what's abnormal for that person.
Thank you for that. A couple other questions along those lines. So we recognize that there's work, but also there's the family part of things. So do you have any tips on how to deal with spouses and maybe coworkers who are having a tough time for this? And how do we approach our spouse when they're having challenges and going through some of the same things that we're going through, but we're not quite sure how to deal with it?
So there's two things with that. The active listening, you cannot go wrong. And active listening, best to start with open-ended questions. So who, what, where, when, why? How are you doing? What was today like for you? Not things that people can say yes or no to. Just check in. You can do that with your spouse, your partner, your colleagues. Just checking in and asking and inquiring. The other thing to do is to, especially for a partner, when you're at home with balancing everything, to not try to engage in a problem-solving conversation when either one of you is in a really emotional place. When your limbic system is in charge, what's called being emotionally flooded, right? Clinically, when you're flooded with emotion, you cannot process information logically. So it's just going to result in a fight. So one of the techniques for communication at home and with family members is to try the extent you can to communicate when everybody is in that sort of more connected and neurologically connected and calm place, because when people are flooded, you're not going to be able to get anywhere. And it's likely to make things worse. So that includes, kids across the spectrum as well as adults. So being sure that you're as calm as possible and really calm, not just putting it on, right? To communicate with family members. And then recognizing that, people tend to have these acting out and acting in patterns, and you can ask open-ended questions to find out what their experience is actually like. So the active listening and the healthy communication strategies.
Thank you for that. Some other questions were about what is normal during this time. We're in a really unique and not really a normal time, but some of the things that people are feeling, they want to know is it normal? One question was, is it normal to have panic attacks at this time? And is there anything you can do about it? How do you reduce reduce this happening to yourself? Yeah,
great question. So panic attacks aren't. I mean, that the experience of panic is normal for sure. A discrete panic attack is certainly it's harder to deal with, but clinical psychology has the science to help with that. We know what to do. There's two things with panic and anxiety, two really important things. Number one, it comes from within. It doesn't happen to you like the weather. And really accepting and acknowledging this isn't something that's coming at me from the outside that I can't control at all. It's something that my body is manifesting as a way to try and manage my situation. It's just not working out very well. So once you realize that it's coming from within, you can engage in very active and discrete coping mechanisms that will help control your body's fight or flight response. So when you have a panic attack, you are going into a fight or flight mode when you don't need to be, right? There's no bear to be running from, but your body is telling you there's a bear here somewhere. And you're getting into that panic mode as a result. If you start to feel that way, it's kind of like a wave, an ocean wave. It gets up to the crest and then it crashes. So once it's crashed, you just kind of have to ride it out. And usually that takes anywhere between 10 to 45 minutes for most people. But at any point until that wave crashes, you are able physiologically to back yourself down from that panic by really calming, focusing on your environment, 5 senses, sight, touch, taste, smell, sound, and deeply breathing. And I know deep breathing is such a cliche, but you cannot have a panic attack and be deep breathing at the same time. You can't do it physically. It's not possible. And when I say deep breathing, I mean both feet on the floor, all the way deep down into your belly, pushing your belly out, and then 4 seconds in and 4 seconds out, really slow and deep. So really trying to recognize the ability that humans have to control their anxiety and then working on mastering it by practicing that kind of control. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy to do, but it is possible. So there's lots of other tools and resources around mindfulness and things on the internet that you can find, but that's what I would start with.
Thank you for that. And on the other side of the spectrum, for folks who have asked about being exhausted or tired all the time, how do you, do you have any tips on how to deal with that? Yeah,
so that's very, very physiological. That's a function of having too much cortisol in our bloodstream for too long. And it's so common right now. So sleep hygiene is a basic, right? Go to bed at the same time every night. Try to limit screen time, limit exposure to media in general. Have a boundary around that for yourself. And then try to wake up at the same time every day. So you can even look up just basic sleep hygiene techniques. There's lots of opportunities and things out there on the internet to learn how to do that. But managing what time you go to bed and what time you wake up, and then also limiting screen time and exposure to media, especially like on our phones in bed, not good neurologically. So that would be one thing. Another thing that you can do in terms of exhaustion in general is to try and build in transitions throughout your day. It's something that's been lost in the hectic sort of work-life pace that we've got going on right now. And if you give yourself even 90 seconds, maybe even a minute, 1 to 2 minutes to transition between the roles that you play, right? Most of us are used to having a commute or something, and some people still do. But for a lot of us that are struggling with that work-life balance is the lack of transition. So we just go literally from right into the next thing, one thing to the next. Taking 60 seconds to, again, with the breathing and calming your body and your brain down is going to help you with that, and it'll help regulate some of that cortisol that's causing the exhaustion. So those two things for that.
Along those lines, there's folks who are playing several different roles. How do you balance it all? I mean, you mentioned boundaries, but is there anything else that people can do with, dealing with partners who are in the same workspace, even kids or parents, or have all these other things that are pulling at them? Is there anything else that you think would be helpful for people to keep in mind to try to ride this out or make the most of it and be resilient? Yeah.
So sit down when neither person is flooded with your partner or even the older kids, and make a schedule. So flexibility and adaptability goes hand in glove with good boundaries. So figure out even if it sounds wackadoodle, like a certain weird working schedule or hours that you would never have worked before, and schedule that around with what works. I've done this with my partner here at home, and he and I have traded off like kid duty, work duty, and it's it's not the way we used to live or the way we used to work, but it's not ideal in many ways, but it's something that we have to do in terms of this adjustment. So a 2 or 3 hour chunk when I'm doing this activity, and then a 2 or 3 hour chunk when I'm doing that. And if you can create a new schedule, and even if it's a week by week schedule, depending on the meetings that you have scheduled or the other things the other obligations and commitments that you have, be creative about how to make that schedule work, and use hours that you didn't think you normally would. Like, for example, I have an hour between 9 and 10 p.m. when I return emails because both of my kids are in bed. And it's an hour that I never used to work, but I'm trading that hour for a different hour earlier in the day when I'm parenting and I'm doing home stuff. So I'm making some adaptations in my schedule as a result. I also encourage everybody to put in their signature line, if you can, Something about how I'm sending this email at a time that works for me. I do not expect you to respond to it or, read it or respond to it at the same time. Just so that we all are acknowledging culturally that people are working flexible in different schedules right now, and that there's not this sense of you had to respond to an email at 2:45 in the morning on a Sunday or whatever. So those are some little pieces. Structure around being creative and flexible, and then putting structure around that.
So there's the opposite end of the spectrum for folks who live alone. Maybe they're not into social media. They don't have strong connections outside of their home. And how do you suggest that they keep some of those, build some resiliency and build some of those ties with folks while they are at home and trying to reduce the amount of contact they have with folks outside in the public?
So there's, it kind of depends on what your interests are. There's been a lot of pet adoptions recently, or in the last 6 months or so. So if that's an option, that's something to consider. There's ways to engage with your neighborhood and your community. You can, physically, if you're able to, bring the garbage cans in for a neighbor. Check in on somebody that might need it. Physically get outside and get some exercise if you can. One of the strategies that we recommend clinically is called behavioral activation. And that is just a matter, it's very simple. It's a matter of picking one behavior that you're going to try that's different. One thing. And it does not matter how big it is or what it is. But you pick something you're going to do differently today. And then you attend to how you feel differently and how you think differently as a result of trying that new behavior. It can be eating something different. It can be trying to exercise, doesn't matter. And small is good because it needs to be a bite-sized chunk, right? It's a manageable goal. But behavioral activation, you can, again, look up lots of resources for that online. It's a highly validated, empirically supported intervention style. So you can check that out for specific ideas that work for you. And yeah, look for opportunities. There's lots of data to show that if you look outwards from yourself, if you try to contribute to something that's bigger than you, you'll feel better. So for people who are isolated, I would recommend looking for ways to contribute on a community level.
Thank you. A few questions about separation of home and work in the same spot.
Hard.
Any tips on how to do that to try to give people the right balance from when they want to be off the clock and focus on home matters?
Yeah, so if you don't have the luxury of physical space separation and you're working at the dining room table or in the bedroom or wherever, right, to try to do that with time and watch the clock, and then from 8 to, I'm just making these numbers up, but like from 8 to 9, that's a work, or 9:30 or 10 is a work chunk of 2 hours, and then the laptop closes, and then you're helping a kid with a Zoom, and then you're doing this, and write it down, because your brain doesn't want to remember any details like that right now. So creating that new schedule, compartmentalizing the time. So work duty and then parent duty. And I know it's hard. There's nothing about this that's just like, oh yeah, let's just do that easy peasy. But if you do it over time and you create a new structure for yourself, you'll feel more calm. The part of what makes us feel totally overwhelmed and harried is that we are actually trying to do too many things at the same time, which we can't do. Right. So it's like, oh, but I should be this email, and then, oh, but now I need to make a snack, and you're kind of all over the place. So slow down a little bit and recognize that things aren't going to get done the way that they used to. We have got to adjust our expectations for ourselves about performance and success outcomes. We are not doing ourselves any favors by pushing for the same expectations and the same results in ourselves that we were doing in January or February. It is not realistic right now. And to sort of back that off, do the best we can under the circumstances, which are incredibly challenging. So compartmentalizing to the extent possible, and that's as good as it can be sometimes.
All right, another question. This is about the upcoming holidays.
Yes.
Any recommendations for practicing resiliency during the holidays for those of us who may not be able to travel and spend time with family for the upcoming Thanksgiving and December holidays? Yeah.
Great question. It's something that our team is working on developing guidance around right now for the Department of Health, because a lot of people are curious about that. You really do have to be creative. It is hard to, we can't spend the time with our family members the way that we did last year. And so there's a lot of loss and there's a lot of sadness associated with that for many people. Sometimes maybe it's not so bad depending on the family. But for those of us who really sort of miss the opportunity to connect, with our family members in that social and emotional way, we have to be creative about it. You can engage in letter writing. You can set up a Zoom Christmas present opening or what have you, depending on the type of holidays that you celebrate. I don't know. There's lots of sort of creative ideas and ways to do it differently. But I think the biggest psychological help for people is to recognize that it does need to be different. And there's an acceptance that's hard there. But once you say, okay, it's just going to be different this year. If you keep pushing for it to be as close to like it was before, like we want it to be like normal, that's more difficult. That's going to be harder to sort of adjust to because it's not as realistic. If you just switch for opportunity and challenge, like, okay, what are the challenges this year? Can't see grandma and grandpa in person. I can't travel to wherever. So you list your challenges, not threats, challenges. And then you say, okay, but what are my opportunities here? We've got technology that we never used to have. Maybe we can do some other Christmas activities, start a new family tradition that we never did before. Maybe we can reach out to people by writing letters to people in long-term care facilities. We never would have done that before, but that helps connect us to people who are isolated. You got to be creative, right? And creativity is hard because that's the part of your brain that doesn't want to be working very well right now, but that's our best bet. So it's an acceptance of it's not going to be normal. We got to stop pushing for it to be the way it was and figure out what are our new opportunities for this set of holidays. That will help.
So another work-related question. So this is about having the conversation with your supervisor, with the way now that you have a better understanding of how you're feeling and some of those stresses that you have in your own life. How do you talk to your boss about what you need to be successful in the workplace with some of these things that folks are dealing with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So try to come to the meeting as prepared and organized as you can be. Try to sit down and give yourself a chunk of time to think about what it is that you think would help you, and be succinct and be clear about what kinds of things you think would help, and then sort of ask them about what the options are, right? What are the opportunities to sort of make things a little flexible? Where is the wiggle room? Maybe there isn't wiggle room over here, but maybe we can do this other thing differently. Maybe this aspect of my job function can be totally remote and we hadn't thought about that before, or this one just can't be and this has to stay this way. And you might not know, right? So I would say get organized, put it on paper. Don't make your brain try and remember it all. Write things down like this is maybe an ideal list or a list of asks. And these are some ideas, and then come with suggestions, come with your own suggestions too. Don't make it a mutual exchange rather than to put it on your supervisor to come up with ideas, because remember the supervisors are also doing the same struggle that we are all doing because nobody's immune to this. So think about what it is you need, think about how you might solve those challenges, and then come in an organized fashion to have that conversation. Those are some steps I would recommend.
Okay, I have lots of questions. We wish we could get to all of them, but I'll try this last one to see where this goes. Folks have been using Zoom to try to cope with the lack of social opportunities early on in the pandemic. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for folks who are feeling Zoom fatigue, those virtual meeting fatigues, and is there a better way to increase some sort of social connections without having to stare at a screen? Is there a way to keep things fresh?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a challenge for sure. Some of the things that I've heard of, or one thing I guess that I've heard of, is that you could do like a neighborhood happy hour where people literally bring lawn chairs out and sit out front in a physical distance kind of way, but they're still socializing. And I've had multiple colleagues tell me that they have had their neighborhoods in some form or fashion have done something like that. And they've gotten to know their neighbors that they've lived next to or nearby for years, and they've never socialized in such a way. So there could be an opportunity with that. Now, granted, as the weather changes, it's a little bit more tough, but something like that. Even doing like an exchange of baked goods or something and leaving things on people's porches, finding other ways to connect. The other thing is that I highly recommend, to the extent that you can, to make Zoom meetings only 50 to 55 minutes long. One of the issues that we're having is going from back to back to back meetings all day, and then we're just staring at a screen for 8 hours in a row. And if you can structure it so that you're giving that 5 to 10 minute Zoom break, right? You get up, you use the facilities, you stretch, you go outside for a second, you do whatever, right? That really, really helps. And you can leave the window open, right? People can still chat, but there's no agenda and there's no expectation that there's a piece of business that needs to be done. And it also leaves that little 5 to 10 minute window for people to chit chat, like the water cooler stuff, which helps us feel connected. So there's a way to use Zoom more effectively, but then there's also things that have nothing to do with the computer that we can try to do more of.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mosseth. This is Chris. I just really want to be mindful of your time and people's time this morning as we transition into different meetings as well. So there's a lot of them these days. So I know we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but we were able to field quite a bit. And then again, I just want to remind folks that are on that this is recorded, so we are going to be able to share this. The goal is to get that out at some point tomorrow afternoon or perhaps Wednesday morning. Secretary Millar, is there anything that you would like to say to close?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Dr. Mosseth, for joining us today. I think you've given us some ideas that'll better equip us all for the months ahead. I also want to thank all of you WSDOT employees for carving out some space in your day to learn more about what we can each do to be resilient. I know the conversation focused on the virus and the pandemic and the rest, but we recognize that built into what we're all dealing with is the social unrest around the killing of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, all of that. What's also built into this is the uncertainty about our budget, and that uncertainty is going to continue for some time. So when we talk about the pandemic, it's the pandemic in all of its manifestations. And we realize that it's complex. We realize it's different for different people. We're doing our best to educate our employees, to educate our supervisors, to educate our managers and senior managers. When we went into the pandemic, we had good bosses and not so good bosses. We had good employees, and we're all in that same space. I would encourage you to, when you have a specific situation, talk to your supervisor about that. If you're not getting what you need, talk to the HR professionals about it. There are means of getting your needs addressed. And what I want to make sure of is that no one gives up on this agency, because you are our most important resource, and we want to make sure that to the extent it is at all possible, we're dealing with or helping you deal with everything you can. We will be sharing this presentation with staff, as Chris indicated. Between now and the next time we get to talk, please take care and stay safe, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.